All right, good evening, everybody. My name is Maco Faniel. I'm the Director of Tutor Training and Justice Education for the Petey Greene program. Um, Thank y'all for joining us for the last webinar of our Spring 2021 Justice Education series. And it looks like we have about 100 people right now. We're expecting about 300, at least that's how many people registered. To join us for a conversation this afternoon titled Defund, Decriminalize, and Abolish. What do they all mean? And so we are here tonight to do some learning, to work through the dissonance that we might be experiencing when we hear the terms defund, decriminalize, and abolish. And finally, we're here to do some reimagining, all right? And so as we gather this afternoon, most of us know that ex-cop Derek Chauvin is on trial in Minnesota for the extrajudicial murder of George Floyd on May 25th of last year. So this happened as most of us were at home on lockdown because of COVID-19. But this also happened as one of the many instances of state-sanctioned and vigilante violence against Black folks over the last few years that was recorded on the cell phone and viewed millions and millions of times over and over. And so we are here because at least since 2013, Black activists, accomplices, and other folks have been screaming, stop killing us and demanding that Black lives matter. So these activists and accomplices and other folks began to connect these extrajudicial murders of Black people to the broader systems that work to delegitimize Black lives in general. And they began to demand that all of these systems be dismantled in order for Black lives to matter. So we are here because these demands got louder and gained more support after the murder of George Floyd. So these demands to defund, decriminalize, and abolish became part of a national conversation and part of the political campaigns of 2020. So this afternoon, we are here because we want to understand these demands and movements and learn how to intersect, think about the role of education in these movements, and really imagine how these movements might lead us to a more just future. And so some of you may be wondering why does this matter to the Petey Greene program? And so this matters to the Petey Greene program because we are one of the many organizations providing educational support for system impacted folk. And we have this theory of change that's focused on improving the educational access for people who've already experienced harm by the carceral state. And we believe that that we're all responsible for each other and that every person deserves this access to education. And so this conversation matters to us because the research that led to our recently approved strategic plan revealed that in order for us to have a world where our volunteers who support system impacted people and system impacted people join together as advocates in reimagining freedom in the criminal legal system, that we needed to do more to help our volunteers connect to advocacy organizations and understand the injustices manifest in the carceral system. And so this conversation matters to us because we see our work in providing educational access as one part of this broader process to remove the edifices that produce and maintain injustice and deny educational access to people. So now that we got that part out the way, I want to introduce you to the people who will facilitate our learning today. And so I'm excited, just like Steve Harvey was on Sunday when he hosted the verses between Earth, Wind, and Fire and the Isley Brothers. And I'm excited because we got this powerhouse panel of legal activists, abolitionists, writers, activists, and historians to join us tonight. And so I know that when we promoted this event, we had 4 panelists. One of our panelists from the Drug Policy Alliance unfortunately had an emergency that came up today. And so we only have 3 tonight. So our first panelist is Reginald Dwayne Betts. And he comes to us as a writer, an advocate. And Dwayne writes about incarceration, the reentry, the broader carceral state, and the meaning-making experiences of Black folks in general. All right. So next we have Victoria Law. All right. And Victoria is a writer and an activist, and her writing focuses on women and incarceration, reform, and abolition. And our last panelist is Dr. Elizabeth Hinton. And Dr. Hinton is a historian who researches, writes on, and teaches about the histories of African Americans and inequality in the United States. So as an expert on the history of policing and mass incarceration, Dr. Hinton is part of a cadre of historians who use a carceral state framework to chronicle how punishment and exclusion have changed over time, explain the multiple causes for mass incarceration, and kind of break down this complex nature of our criminal legal system. So you can learn more about our panelists and check out their readings by hitting up our website, the Petey Greene program.org. And so now let's go ahead and get started. Reginald, Dwayne, Victoria, and Elizabeth, thank you all again for hanging out with us this afternoon. And so I kind of want to get started with a question that moves us beyond your biographies that you have on like your websites and in your books. And I'm hoping that you can like briefly introduce yourselves beyond these bios, but really, how did you come to be a scholar or a writer or an activist that's concerned about the carceral state, incarcerated folks, like rethinking what freedom and justice means. And so I guess we'll get started with Victoria.
Okay, so I went to high school in Queens in the 1990s. I went to a high school that we would now call a school to prison pipeline high school. Mm-hmm. We didn't have such terminology then. It was just a high school that all families tried to avoid if they had resources to do so. It was mostly Black, brown immigrants. There were something like 4,000 students in the high school. It was the perfect recruiting ground for gangs that were happening in New York City at the time. And many of my friends joined gangs, dropped out of high school, got arrested for gang-related activity, ended up at Rikers Island. So for folks who may not be aware, we have an island that is all jails in New York City. We don't have a good public school education system, but we have an island full of jails, and then to prison. So that was what got me started on wondering what was this giant institution that had encroached upon my life all of a sudden and swept so many of my friends away. So I started reading about prisons. I started visiting my friends at Rikers and then upstate, and everything I saw inside those prison waiting rooms and visiting rooms confirmed everything that I was reading about how prisons are racist, how they serve as a type of racialized social control of people. I wasn't seeing people like Jeffrey Epstein or Bernie Madoff in there. Nobody had chopped up their wife and put them in a refrigerator. Nobody had done these egregious things. It was mostly people who were poor, who lacked economic opportunities, sometimes harmed other people in their actions, like many of my friends did, but were not necessarily these monsters that the media made them out to be.
Thank you for that. Dr. Hinton.
This is actually a good follow-up because my story is very similar to Victoria's. I'm an old millennial. I came of age during the 80s and the 90s, so at the height of the war on drugs and gangs. And I witnessed firsthand the impact of drug abuse and incarceration on my family, but also understood the kind of larger context that led to that incarceration and to the process of criminalization in general. And when I started my PhD at Columbia, I began visiting relatives in prison and in California, and I was just stunned at what I saw. Many of the things that Victoria described, that especially in the early 2000s, were not really being talked about. This was before mass incarceration was a buzzword, and I wanted, as a PhD student, to figure out how we got to this point. And then I think just briefly from a kind of academic perspective, I came to these questions about the history of mass criminalization from a Black studies background. And when I started to do this work, we had a much more rich sense of the history of the civil rights movement and Black Power organizations, but we really didn't have a sense of how the kind of shifts in policy after the civil rights movement that eventually fostered mass criminalization. So that question, that gap, really guided my research as well. So it was both like a personal and intellectual pursuit for me.
Yeah, thank you for that, Dr. Hinton. And so we'll shift to Dwayne. Like, how did you come to this work or these concerns?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that's an interesting question because I don't know if I came to this work or these concerns. I mean, I don't even know if I do this work.
Mm-hmm.
And I sort of feel like, you know, Victoria asked me a question earlier. She was like, "What is that on your wall?" And I was like, "Well, you know, I explained it in some detail, but the truth is, I could say it's the clothes of friends of mine who were doing life in prison and who got killed by the prison system, and it's, you know, me turning those clothes into paper and me embedding that paper with that pleas for freedom. I mean, literally, I could show you, you know, squares that have the ripped up letters where people are giving me the address to the parole board and saying, "Can you help me get out?" And so, you know, my relationship to this work is because I grew up in prison. Um, you know, I grew up in the middle of all of it, and I think for some of us, when you grow up in the middle of all of it, it has a kind of gravity on your life. And if you keep finding yourself in positions where you could do something to help, whether it's to, you know, write an op-ed, write a book, you know, you do it. As I remember my wife told me this word perseverate, and shit is great because it's one of those words that just means one thing. It's like penultimate, you know, it just means the thing it means. And I perseverate over prison, and to keep myself from going mad, I find new ways to contemplate that thing and how you might make, or I might make that contemplation lead to freedom for somebody else.
So, Dwayne, it's been a decade since I studied for the GRE. Can you break down that word for us? Perseverate.
Yeah, it means to obsess over something. It means to not be able to let something go. It's like when you know, like a dog with a bone is another way to put it.
Mhm.
Or or a fucking prosecutor with a mandatory minimum.
Yeah.
I shouldn't have said that. But yeah, though it means to not be able to let something go, and as much as I want to, prison is a central aspect of my life. I mean, that's, you know, I don't like words like carceral, but if I try to define it, what it means is that it becomes a central aspect of your life, you know. And actually, carceral is actually a pretty cool word for the sound of it.
Yeah.
But it is like when I think of carceral, I mean the centrality of everything, you know, um, related to prison.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I think what uh, what you all point to is um, this this witnessing of the uh, the impact of um, like punishment and exclusion on the lives of friends and loved ones, but then, you know, on your life also. And so thank y'all for that. So I want to break this conversation up into like three parts. And so one on like defund, and one part about decriminalization, and one part about abolish. All of these can, of course, stand alone. And so as I mentioned in the beginning, this conversation that we're having right now is, you know, partially a result of the murder of George Floyd by Derek Chauvin. And I say that because uh, more folks and more organizations are able to like say the word abolish now. We're able to say the word defund now. We're able to say the word decriminalize because like these multiple contingencies began to like come together last summer that made this possible. And so after Floyd was murdered, and you know, Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, there was this crescendo of defund the police, and these demands were made. and from like multiple people. And then later in the year, and no, I think it was November or December, President Obama, when he was on his tour for his memoir, made a critique of it and reduced it to just a slogan, saying that it was a distraction from what was like what really needed to happen. And so I'm wondering, so Victoria, for everybody, like what does, when you hear it or in your experience or your work, like what does like defund the police like mean? And I guess we can start with Dr. Hinton.
Well, the way that I think about it is a call to, and a call that's been a long call throughout the 20th century. That's been kind of the guiding principle of struggles for social justice and racial justice in the Black freedom movement, and that is for a set of investments to promote community health and access to resources and opportunities and the full benefits of American citizenship and full access to resources. So, this includes job creation programs. This includes investing in vibrant school systems. This includes decent housing that's not overrun with roaches and rats and plumbing that barely works. These are calls upon the state, upon the government to meet basic human needs, and a kind of different view of what public safety is and can be. And so when I hear defund, I think about those sets of investments and the fact that this nation has chosen to not invest in those things for marginalized communities, for communities that have suffered from historical discrimination and exclusion, and instead invest in managing the consequences of poverty and inequality through policing and surveillance and incarceration. So defund, to me, is a call to flip that script, is a call to fulfill the promises of the freedom movement and to make a different set of investments in the communities that have been long denied them and in the communities that have been targeted by the mechanisms of the carceral state.
Yeah, that sounds good. Victoria, Reginald, thing to add?
To everything she said. I mean, we also saw defunds come out this past summer because we were also seeing the vast inequalities that were happening with the healthcare system. You had doctors and nurses wearing garbage bags and reusing masks, and then you have police looking like, I don't know, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles or something, or RoboCop. Like, what were they needed for? So, I mean, it was a very stark contrast. So everything that Dr. Hinton said is true. And then we kind of see this come to our head as everybody is stuck in their homes, looking at social media, looking at these images of doctors and nurses in overflowing hospitals and people being put into, ice trailers when they die. And then looking at the fact that police budgets continue to be so bloated. What do we need this for? So it was, even for people who might not have been down with defunding in 2019 or 2018, we're like, wait, this is actually not where I want my money to go. Why are we talking about cutting every other service in this pandemic year, but we are going to continue expanding money and giving money to these death-making institutions?
Dwayne?
Yeah, I don't have anything to add. I mean, I will say, I guess I will add one thing. I think I struggle like with a phrase like death making institution. Cause I guess because I grew up in a death making institution, which is prison. But when I was running the streets, I mean, I was also a part of a death making institution. And I want to talk to my grandmother. You know what I mean? Like I want to talk to my aunts. and I want to talk to my uncles, and when shit goes down, they calling the police, and like I don't know, man. I wonder. See, motherfuckers don't really like me. I mean, I can't get no job. I ain't gonna have tenure nowhere. My cousin just got out of prison, can't get a job nowhere. And what happens is when the people who are comfortable find ways to. I think about correctional officers who got a high rate of suicide, a high rate of alcoholism. And I was a convict. I ain't talked to COs. I went in when I was 16. I ain't had no relationship with correctional officers. They wasn't giving me shit. They wasn't bringing me nothing. They wasn't doing me no favors. I tried to stay out the way. But I don't know if we win this by finding new and inventive ways to denigrate the people who we disagree with. Because I'm always in a group of people that's being denigrated. Whether it's you know, John Lennon wrote a dope piece about COVID in upstate New York. I read the comments. Motherfucker, you shouldn't have killed nobody. What you mad about? And so it's like I don't know, man. It's like when I think about defund the police, I think about putting resources in a community where they need to be placed. I think about finding ways to train the police officers that's necessary, but getting rid of the ones that aren't. Um, I think about fucking understanding in some really fundamental way where's the black hole that all of this money goes to, and I think that we could like say those things. Um, and I've been on the corner where they arrested people of mine who I know ain't have no business in handcuffs. Where my response is to create my own death making institution. And I've been like in the apartments where we talk about who just got murdered, and my response is to make my own death making institutions. And the thing that makes me resist that is some belief that communities could figure out something that gives us a better sense of safety, um, and a better sense of accountability. And maybe that's not the police as they look like now, but I don't know, man. I find a lot of this, the way that we talk about the police be the same way that folks talk about dudes that's still in prison now. Virginia parole board. You let out a cop killer. I mean, all of the Virginia Republicans are like, I can't believe the parole board has let out a cop killer. And I'm not hearing none of the people who be talking about the righteous stuff out there defending the parole board for releasing this cop killer. And he is not a cop killer. He is like a grown ass man who has grown to be a mentor and a light in the community where he was in when he was in prison, and who deserved to be free. But I'm just saying that it's slippery. It's slippery when the police become a death making institution. Then my man becomes a cop killer. It's two sides of the same coin.
Uh, Elizabeth or Victoria, you all want to respond to that?
Well, I guess because I'm the one that calls it a death-making institution, I should respond. I see your point about, like the power of language, but at the same time, I think there's also a pushback of people. There's a narrative that we're taught from a very young age that, from like all those like cop shows that like are on TV for little kids, like, like cops is like animals or something like that, to the school safety seminars where it's like, like if you get lost, go find a cop, to all these cop shows and cop movies that we see, all the time on television for movies, which kind of glorifies the police, and when police act extrajudiciously, like they're applauded in these shows. Very rarely is there a, or if they are taken down, they're taken down by other police officers. They're not taken down by like community responses. So for me, saying death-making institution is pushing back against this idea that police are these like life-saving people. I mean, we know that most violence is not reported to the police. They don't, and also they don't prevent violence from happening. They come after violence has happened, or in the case of George Floyd, they create violence when they show up. So for me, it's a push back for that. Would I call it a death-making institution if I was talking to your aunts and your grandparents? Probably not. I mean, I feel like this is also a space where people are more receptive, because who comes to a seminar called Defund, Decriminalize, and Abolish if you are not already sort of curious about this? But I would not go to somebody's church or synagogue or mosque or temple and say, you know, and use this kind of language as well. But I get your point about, you know, being very careful about language and not to denigrate.
And I'm cussing and shit. I mean, I'm clearly not that careful about language.
Let me just also just highlight something that Dwayne said that I think is really profound and important. And that is that, you know, he said, prisons, you know, if we're using this terminology, right, that prisons are death-making institutions, but the streets are too. And I think that's really the kind of crux of the problem. And that gets actually in many ways to the heart of defund, because, you know, the question is, after more than 5 decades of national wars on crime and drug and gangs, the question is, you know, why is it that some communities still remain really unsafe, and that especially in the communities that are over policed and are underprotected, that young people of color especially are more likely to die either at the hands of one another or a police officer. And to me, again, this has so much to do with our investments, our resource priorities, and the fact that there is a direct relationship between policing and incarceration and violence that I think has been deeply, deeply unexamined, and that can be addressed meaningfully if we approach public safety outside of the logic of police, approaching public safety by giving people jobs, giving people opportunities, and as Dwayne said, putting money into communities where that money is needed.
So I'm gonna come back to this in a second, and to extend on what you were saying, Dr. Hinton. I'm wondering if you can, you know, as brief as possible as you can, kind of walk us through this this moment that you touch on in your first book about this enlargement of policing forces, and this like this more money going to policing forces from the federal government, and also this simultaneous movement to like push back against that.
So it's really significant, and I think in the narratives that we tell, or like the dominant narratives about the war on drugs, is that, you know, that it's a Ronald Reagan 1980s thing, but actually the origins of the kind of policing regime or apparatus that we see today are in the, you know, occur at the moment at the height of progressive social change and the civil rights movement and liberal social policy. And, you know, it's significant that Lyndon Johnson calls for the war on poverty and the war on crime at the same time. These are both, you know, central parts of the Great Society. And ultimately, the crime war wins out. Ultimately, we don't get a job creation program for poor people. We get job training for poor people without the infrastructure or resources put into securing jobs for people, and a major job creation program and kind of a new industry for law enforcement and police. And, you know, I think a lot of times people say, well, crime control is a state and local issue and the federal government doesn't have to do anything about it. But this moment is really important because the Johnson administration essentially breaks with the previous 200 years of US history and begins setting up new grant programs from the federal government to local police departments directly. And on top of that, the federal government, through the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968, essentially forces states to create criminal justice planning agencies and local governments in big cities like New York and Chicago and LA, in order to receive the hundreds of millions of new dollars that the federal government is pumping into modernizing law enforcement, expanding the prison system, enhancing knowledge production and statistical measures of crime, et cetera. And this $1 billion, this eventually $1 billion worth of investment, 25 billion in total before Ronald Reagan took office, far eclipsed the federal outlay for social programs. So eventually the war on crime won out over the war on poverty. And by the time, many of these grant programs were restructured during the 1980s, and the federal government forced state governments to make crime into a major issue. the bureaucracy and the apparatus at the state and local level had already been established. So, you know, this war on crime from the outset targeted young Black people in low-income communities that federal policymakers and the social scientists they consulted, like Daniel Patrick Moynihan and others, believed were responsible for the majority of the nation's crime, and were believed or responsible, perhaps even more importantly, for urban rebellions in nearly every major city and thousands of segregated low-income communities in the late 60s and early 70s. So in many ways, this law enforcement response, or this new war on crime and law enforcement program responded to the gains of the civil rights movement and violent political protests in urban centers across the United States.
Yeah, and so I think, like, thank you for that. I think what I'm a couple of things I'm hearing from that is that there was a moment where funding could have went to the programs and the communities that needed it most to kind of deal with it's like root causes. But you know, other decisions were made, and like what we have right now, or what we've lived in for the last 50 or so years, didn't always exist. And so, and I mean, I'm biased. I'm a historian, so I'm biased to that, like that chronicling and to explain that present moment. But I want to ask Dwayne first, and then I'll come to Victoria. So if we think about like language again, like what language like makes sense for you? Because like you did talk about like this investment and like redistribution on like public safety, but like what language makes sense for you if like defund, or if defund doesn't make sense?
Oh, I don't care about defund. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, I think that I think it's just a word, you know. And anyway, it's so interesting. I was talking to we were talking about this. I was on a call with I was on a panel with James Foreman, and we was talking about the new Jim Crow and the ways in which you know, it could be an argument made that it's something that might take a step too far with the new Jim Crow in terms of trying to characterize what happened, right? Um, uh, um, Wilford Rembrandt just passed. He was a artist who lived here in New Haven, and what's crazy is you know, he was from his name Winfred Rembrandt. He was on a, you know, he was locked up, learned how to do leather work while he was inside, and they had tried to lynch him, you know, on some flim flam shit, and they hung him up, they strung him up by his feet, and they cut into his groin, and somebody saved his life, you know. One of the white men was like, nah, you take him to jail. He was serving like 7 years, and he became an artist, and he lived here in New Haven. He went through the Jim Crow South. I'm not gonna fucking compare my experience to his. You know, he was talking about Georgia, where if you came into town and you happen to approach a white dude, they would make you fucking put your head in a barrel and laugh in it. I mean, it's the kind of denigration um, and systematic denigration that is completely just tied to you being black. That, you know, I put a pistol to somebody's head. So maybe if I've sold dope or something, and I felt like I was, like Biggie said, just trying to feed my family, I would be more like able to disconnect my own absurd behavior um, from the absurdity of the state. But so me and James were like going back and forth, and it's this thing that I don't want to act like what I suffered through is what Rembrandt suffered through, who experienced both of these pernicious systems, both Jim Crow and incarceration, right? And yet, what James was saying is like in 2005 when I came home, ain't nobody know the word mass incarceration. It's like Elizabeth said, wasn't nobody talking about mass incarceration. I came home and righteous progressive organizations were saying we would let her hire you, Dwayne, but your criminal record might cause us not to get funding. And now motherfuckers be like, hey, Dwayne, we love you. You know, can you be on this grant? I mean, your criminal record might get us some dough. And so what I want to say is, this is what James said though. We would not be here right now if it wasn't for Michelle Alexander's New Jim Crow. And that is true. And the question is only, would we be further if we had to invent another way to push that point? And I don't know. And so with Defund the Police, I'm saying like we wouldn't be where we are right now if we didn't have a language to latch onto that made us grapple with difficult questions. And the real question and the burden and the onus on us is to figure out how to take that to get it to wherever we imagine we need to go. How to take that and clarify it in all of the ways that it needs to be clarified and explained. But I mean, shit, Willie Horton worked for them. How come defund can't work for us? So I'm all right with that. I don't want to criticize the language we use. I just want to put a little bit of pressure on it and make sure we all agree that we could disagree about what that means while all trying to push toward the same space.
Yeah, thank you. I guess, so Victoria, before we move on to like decriminalize, like what does a world, I guess, without policing or redistributed funds, or what does public safety look like in this world where policing is defunded?
Well, I think we can look at our wealthier, whiter neighbors, you know, for an image or a blueprint. They're not perfect. You know, there's still family violence and domestic violence and child abuse, but the police are not called at the drop of a hat for everything. So, you know, you can go to school and you can get into a fist fight, you know, if kids still do that anymore, or you can like graffiti on the desk or whatever kids do these days in school, and the police are not called on you. You don't end up in handcuffs because you're doing dumb things that kids do. You can have, you know, like a neighborhood where kids aren't stopped and harassed and frisked and surveilled and monitored and possibly arrested or brutalized by the police. You know, they can go about their business. You don't have militarized police patrolling all the time. So, I mean, if we want to say, like, you know, what would reduced policing look like, we can look at that. But these are also the areas that have a tremendous amount of resources. So it's not just take away the police and let everybody just figure it out. It's also like, these are the places with better schools. These are the places with better healthcare. These are the places where if you go and say you are using a criminalized substance when you're not supposed to because you are pregnant or because you're, you know, in rehab or whatever, they don't call the police on you. You know, your doctor may say, you know, Victoria, we really don't think you should be using heroin while you're pregnant. And I could say, okay, doctor, what should I do? But they won't automatically go into the next room, pick up the phone, call the police, you know, have me arrested on, you know, some
Or like, you
charges.
know, here in New Haven, I mean, the absurdity is here in New Haven. If animal protection in New Haven is the police. So I once had a client who had a dog that died, right? And it's tragic. I got a puppy. You can't be going to kill dogs. They called the police, and look, it was a misdemeanor, right? Carries up to a year in prison. The prosecutor was like, she had 2 children in diapers. Prosecutor said, look, you could cop to a year suspended after 5 months. What? Are you serious? And you know, as a defense attorney, you're supposed to like take every plea back to your client. I'm in the chambers. I'm like, my client is not accepting that. My supervisor attorney's like, you can't do that. I'm like, that shit is absurd. I'm literally about to get fired. And one argument is that this is like the prosecutor. But another argument is that the police should have never been involved from the jump. You know, this was a woman who was in dire straits. Police should have never been involved. So I 100% agree with that.
Yeah. So, I mean, so if we look at it this way, it is what Dr. Hinton was saying before, defund, but also it's not defund and just squirrel the money away for a rainy day, defund and put them back in the institutions that we actually need in communities. You know, the woman isn't, like Dwayne said, the woman was in dire straits. What did she need? She did not need to be in handcuffs. She did not need the threat of being torn away from her children. She did not need to be in a police station or a courtroom, you know, accepting some ridiculous plea that would take her away from her family. You know, what could all of that money have done instead of trying to tear her life apart?
Yeah. So I think just to summarize, I hear you all saying that giving folks what they need, placing money into programs that give folks what they need, shifting responsibilities of what police do, yeah. So I'll leave it at that because a lot of this will be connected later. So I want to shift to decriminalize, and so I'll start with you, Dwayne. As a jurist, what does like decriminalize mean from like your perspective as a jurist? I mean, I'm speaking of like, in this case, like decriminalization of drugs. Like, what does that mean?
You're on mute.
It's actually interesting and complicated because when we say decriminalization of drugs, I think it probably will lead to the decriminalization of a lot of conduct, right? So, but one, I think just possessing, personal quantities of narcotics just shouldn't be criminalized. It just should not be a gateway into the criminal justice system, and it happens in ways that I think are like, it's just really slick. You walking through a park and you homeless, and everybody could tell you are a homeless drug addict. And so the police press you out because you're homeless, and they do it with the outside chance that you got some residue on you. Because you clearly don't have enough money to afford any kind of real narcotics. Then you get caught with some residue, and now you caught, and you're not gonna beat the case. So now you're in the system again. And if you got priors, you're gonna plead out. And so I think you think about what does it mean to decriminalize? I mean, one, that person has no contact with the system anymore. And I only worked as a defense attorney for a year. I couldn't stand. I mean, I couldn't stand it. Actually, to be honest, right? It just hurt, going in and your best hope is to keep somebody out of prison, and you do everything you can to keep them out of prison, but you know that you aren't doing anything to address the larger challenges that they face in their life. And sometimes you just don't like people, and you don't, what I mean, it's like, I know people that's doing life in prison who are doing so much work to make their lives better, and I'm in here with you, and you keep lying to me and like talking this crazy shit in my ear. It was like stressful. And one of the things about this work is you're supposed to pretend like you love everybody, and everybody aren't coming with all kinds of challenges that challenge you. But I just couldn't do it. But I had multiple clients though whose interaction with the police were for small amounts of narcotics, and they clearly had underlying issues that the system wasn't able to take care of, whether it was homelessness, whether it was addiction. Even when they were going to drug treatment, the system didn't care, and they would come in and have to plead out, because they were confronting a mandatory minimum. But the prosecutor would say, well, you could just add another felony to your collection, and then we give you, probation. So I think decriminalizing avoids a whole lot of that stuff. I think the larger challenge, though, and I'll stop talking, but the larger challenge is what happens when somebody's selling narcotics, right? And you got $200 worth of dope on you, and then you get popped, and then they reduce it down to a charge that doesn't even give you a misdemeanor or a felony, but you owe somebody, $400. Well, what you gonna do? Well, you got to get another package because you owe somebody $400. And I think like defense attorneys see how complicated this gets, and how people end up with, like, I see one kid come in with just a $200 beef and it gets dropped, and so he doesn't even have a criminal record, but it's clear he owes somebody money. And so 6 months later, how does he have 3 felonies? Because he wasn't a good drug dealer, and every time he got caught, he was like a gambler. Man, I'm just going to like do this thing and then I'm out. And so 6 months later, now you're doing a year or 2 years, but you got 3 felonies on your record, or a misdemeanor, 2 felonies. So you on your way to never having stable employment. And I think decriminalization answers some of those questions, but it doesn't answer the questions around how to approach people who feel like they need to sell drugs out of a necessity.
Thank you for that. I think one of the things that you kind of answered for us that I was going to ask Dr. Hinton to do is that the criminalization of drugs is like serves as a pretext for police to like do so many other things. Okay, and I think most of us on here know that like this criminalization of drugs, over time, over a 50-year time period, like changed policing at the same time. And so So as an example, in Houston the drug arrest increased by 193% from 1983 until 2003. And so there's like this completely changed policing and interactions with policing because this was incentivized. And so I guess if we can look back in history, Dr. Hinton, we take for granted that what's criminalized now, particularly when we think about like drugs, like what drugs are criminalized now have always been criminalized. And so I guess, can you talk briefly about like this, like the criminalization process, like how and why like drugs became criminalized in the first place?
Well, just one point to make at the outset is that, drug laws at all levels of government have always been used to target racial groups, from opioid laws in California, targeting Asian Americans, to marijuana laws, targeting Mexican Americans, to crack laws in the 80s, targeting Black Americans. So drug laws have been effective in terms of policing and incarcerating racially marginalized groups. And, one of the things that I think is really interesting here and important is that, through the 1970s, the question of how we would treat drug abuse, the question of whether or not people who abuse drugs would be treated by the criminal legal system was still up in the air. Remember during the Nixon administration, heroin addicts had access to methadone clinics and methadone treatment funded by the federal government. And it really was in the 1980s that Houston statistic that you cited is really significant. It wasn't until the 1980s and Ronald Reagan's iteration of the war on drugs that those decisions were made, and that drug abuse became a criminal issue. And a lot of this has to do with the ways in which policymakers and criminologists had concluded by the late 1970s that a long held belief that certain groups, and that Black and brown people in particular, were latently criminal, really took hold in a powerful way in domestic policy. And the idea was that that drug abuse was a gateway to larger crimes. And if you rounded up people who abused drugs, then and who were involved in the informal drug economy, then you would be preventing worse crimes from happening. And so this kind of preemptive policing, zero tolerance policing, broken windows policing, whatever you want to call it, community policing as it evolved in the 90s, really promoted the aggressive enforcement of misdemeanors. So, as we've been talking about, not only drug crimes, but things like jaywalking, things like truancy, as a way to arrest people who law enforcement officials and policymakers assumed would surely go on to create more or be involved in more serious crimes due to, again, long held perceptions and assumptions about Black criminality. So a lot of this is based on racism and assumptions, and these drug policies have targeted Black and brown communities on purpose. And one last thing I'll say is that, in terms of the transformation of policing itself. So in addition to, increased reliance on stop and frisk and arresting people for basically no reason, and accompanied by mandatory minimum sentences and longer and longer prison terms for targeted groups, police departments really reaped the benefits and through new forfeiture laws, the increased reliance on raids and stings, while police departments themselves were involved in many of the drug trades. I mean, one of the revelations of my book, and I'll just say this and end here, is that the Broward County Police Department was actually did a cocaine raid, seized a number of pounds of powder cocaine, and then started producing crack on the third floor of the county courthouse in order to then go sell in Black communities in Miami and arrest people for. So again, I mean, this really shows the ways in which policing becomes entangled in informal economies and entangled in crime itself. And it's crazy to think that law enforcement officials themselves were manufacturing crack to then go out and arrest people for abusing crack. So I'll end it there in terms of how it changed policing.
It changes our understanding of who the cocaine cowboys were.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And why more cocaine, more like tons more cocaine. I don't know, I forgot off the top of my head, it's in my book, but came into the United States as the Reagan administration was tightening up the border and declaring the war on drugs. So another question, like during the war on drugs, why is it that cocaine flooded into the United States and created a surplus that led to the proliferation of the crystallized form of cocaine in crack? So again, many of these policies and economies are deeply tied, and it raises the larger question of what the purpose is of these crime control programs that have been so ineffective at actually achieving their stated aims.
So, Dwayne, you mentioned Michelle Alexander's book a few moments ago. So I think we're in year 11 right now. The book has been out for 11 years now, and that Alexander makes this sweeping argument that that the causal factor for mass incarceration, particularly at the federal level, is this war on drugs. And so when I read this, when I began reading it a decade ago, I read it a couple of times. I couldn't imagine that we would have these decriminalization campaigns and there would be some wins. And so, for instance, in Oregon, in November, there's a decriminalization of all drugs. And then in several other states, there has been decriminalization of drugs. And today, actually, I live in Virginia now. So today, the Assembly in Virginia is meeting about decriminalization again to speed up the process. And so, and when we think about Oregon, like these wins came about because of like 20 years of organizing, drug policy alliances on the ground. And then there's this like local like advocacy groups. But really like this movement for Black Lives was like this catalytic factor over the last couple of years. And then like Donald Trump and Jeff Sessions, like when the room is saying you need to decriminalize, they're trying to get tougher. And so, there's these wins right now, and I think this points to like the process of policy change. But I'm wondering from you and Victoria, what do these wins mean? Like, what do they mean for communities, for people who struggle with drug addiction? Like, what do they mean for women that are victims of this drug war? Like, what does this mean on the ground?
I bet Victoria has a better answer than me, but I will say that I think one of the things that wins mean is that it's easy to reflect and see how much work went to them when you talk to people who have been on the ground doing this for 20 years. I think that's powerful. Think about families against mandatory minimums. I mean, you just think about people who, when I went in, they were struggling with these issues around drugs and decriminalization and mandatory minimum. So it has been like a long fight, and I think that's one thing that the wins mean. But for me, I mean, you mentioned Jeff Sessions. I think about William Barr. I think about how do you hide a case for more incarceration as your attorney general, and then we're gonna talk about like reform efforts. The dude literally wrote an argument for more prisons, and so one, I think the wins mean that we're pushing forward in one lane, but it makes me ask, are there other lanes that we need to find ways to push forward in? You in Virginia, I mean, the parole board released Bro Vincent, 40 years. Richmond Times Dispatch did story after story after story saying they released a cop killer. I mean, every week they were trying to get subscribers by putting this out there. The person that's running for attorney general comes out with a plan to get rid of parole for violent offenders. And so we talk about the gains, And for me, I hear those gains and I ask about what are the parallel losses. And one of the things that is still always the case is you could get more ink for more prisons than you can for less prisons. And so, I'm not versed in the drug conversation because all of my friends are locked up for robbery, for murder, for assault, for attempted murder, and those are the people I represent. And so I want to stay in my lane and acknowledge that what those wins mean for me is I'm not doing as effective a job trying to get on the agenda the lives of my friends because I do believe that if we paid more attention to violence, everything else will fall into place. One of the crazy things about struggling to get the wins that we should have in the area of drugs is that you fast forward and what Michelle Alexander missed is just that most of the people in prison aren't in prison for drug crimes. They're in prison for violent crimes. And as recently as 2 months ago, I had an esteemed scholar say on a call, most of the people in prison are in prison for drugs. And I was like, I think that that's absolutely incorrect. And she said, where are you getting your data from? Oh, it was such a funny moment. But I'm saying it's persistent that like we always fighting the war on two fronts. And so Trump was able to be the president for black folks when it came to pardons and clemencies, right? But then he has the case for, more incarceration. And I think we're always fighting the war on two fronts. And the wins mean we're winning one front. But maybe we need to pay attention to the other front as well.
And I thank you for saying that. And I'm gonna go to Victoria after this. I thank you for saying that because, this webinar is primarily for our volunteers or mostly college students who are concerned about the a system that the school to prison pipeline harm and educational justice. And sometimes I think because of like our education system and many other reasons that there's not a good understanding of how like social movements work, how long like policy change takes place, and also this simultaneous like struggle where there's the like this push for change, and then there's a push for like going back. So Victoria, same question, like what does this mean on the ground?
I mean, I think it takes a tool away, like what Dwayne was saying. It takes a tool away from police and prosecutors. So yeah, you don't have to, like police nabbing somebody who is homeless and like searching them for residue. It takes away the tools that they've used to cudgel and punish Black and brown communities. But there are so many other tools at their disposal. None of my high school friends were arrested for drugs. Aside from some weed, none of us actually did any drugs. We're all arrested for armed robbery, unarmed robbery, kidnapping, pretty, serious violent crimes, not drugs. So, decriminalization without pouring resources back into the communities that have often been ravaged by drugs and by policing, but just removing drug criminalization doesn't mean that any of my friends would not have chosen to join gangs, drop out of school, get arrested for armed robbery, unarmed robbery, kidnapping, etc. They all still would have gotten arrested because there were still no opportunities that they could see. You stay in school for 4 years and maybe you get a job at Kmart, or maybe you get a job at the Pioneer supermarket and you make minimum wage. Maybe if you work really hard, you make up to $7 an hour because minimum wage was only $4 back then. But if you're not seeing a future, then that other future that dangles in front of you, especially when you were a teenager, looks really good. And at the same time, we also have to remember that there are lots of people who use drugs that have been criminalized, that live in middle-class homes, go to work every day, everything else, but are not ravaged by policing, that are not ravaged by, racism, that are in communities that are well-resourced. And they go and they use their illicit drugs. I mean, I point to Dr. Carl Hart's book.
I knew you were going to say that.
Yeah, using drugs, and, he's just like, yeah, you know, I use drugs. I, you know, go to my, you know, tenure job at Columbia University. It's all great, you know, and like there's so many other people that use drugs and can. I don't want to speak to like whether or not you can or cannot as a person who only drinks alcohol and coffee, but you know, we have to also remember that people are criminalized, not necessarily because of their drug use, but also because of their race, their class, their gender identity. Decriminalization doesn't make cops stop harassing trans women when they're walking down the street trying to go to work or to their boyfriend's house or to the club or to the grocery store. It doesn't stop, you know, it doesn't stop police from harassing or abusing women when they think that they can get away with it. Look at Oklahoma when Daniel Holtzclaw, the man who was sentenced to some like a century behind bars for sexually assaulting Black women. This didn't just stop at Black women who were using drugs. He also sexually assaulted young girls that were in this like police intern program. He sexually assaulted a daycare worker. You know, he thought that he could just get away with it. So I think, again, we have to remember that taking drug criminalization out takes a tool away, but we have to kind of see it as if you were looking at like a surgeon's table or something, like you take away this one tool and there's still all these other tools that can be used to inflict harm on somebody.
Yeah. Well, what you just said, and is that so part of decriminalization, at least in some states, is a redistribution. So part of it is an expungement of records, and then also a redistribution. So in diversion, where folks can get treatment, there's education, there's housing, and there's money put other places. And so and so it is part of like a defunding, like decriminalization is part of like a defunding effort, and also an abolition effort. And I think that, you know, we can have like a whole 3 hours on this next part about abolition, because I think there's Michelle Alexander's text and the movements over the last decade have like helped us to make this word, like this term and this movement, mainstream. Like folks can say it without fear of like losing their jobs. And so we got about I want to like spend 10 minutes on this because I want to get to the audience questions. But Dr. Hinton, if you can, when I hear abolition, the first time I heard of it wasn't about prisons, okay? And so of the history that I got before college and grad school, abolition was associated with slavery in the United States. And so can you like talk to us briefly about like what was the vision of the abolition of slavery, and what was the vision of like a reconstructed society?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I think that the abolitionist movement today has a lot of many important lessons to build on and learn from the movement to abolish slavery. I mean, just quickly, as a, you know, it took centuries for abolition to be realized. This movement had been growing for some time, and when it really began to gain steam, it was because it put enslaved people and formerly enslaved people at the forefront of the movement. And actually, you know, their testimonies and their experiences of enslavement were widely shared and actually helped raise awareness to just how violent and brutal and inhumane the system of slavery was. So, you know, so that's one thing to say. And also, you know, when people talk today about how abolition is some kind of like utopic idea or it can never happen, I mean, that's, you know, in 1863, nobody thought that slavery in the United States would ever be abolished. Slavery seemed to be a permanent feature of the Southern economy, just as prisons seem to be today a permanent feature of American life. So I think, you know, that in the sense indicates that change is possible and that you can abolish and eradicate exploitative and racist institutions. but there are, it's also kind of the story is kind of a tragedy in the sense that, there was, again, this hope for a truly robust abolition democracy that would shift the balance of power, that would redistribute resources to formerly enslaved people that had been denied them, and that would create an American democracy that lived up to founding principles based on equality. And for one, that was undermined because of the new criminal laws and the kind of expanding system of incarceration that emerged immediately after emancipation, in part because of the loophole of the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment allowing people to be enslaved or abolishing slavery except for punishing as for a crime. And in part because there is a tendency that every time, we saw it in 1965 too, that we talked about at the beginning, every time rights expand to Black Americans in particular in US history, new forms of criminalization and new levels of incarceration emerge in response. And also because, that abolition democracy was undermined because of in part because the Republican Party and the threat of white supremacist and vigilante violence in the Republican Party essentially cowing to that and saying, like, we don't want to continue to fight this war anymore. We're going to withdraw our troops from the South. We're going to withdraw the protections that we had been giving to newly freed people against white supremacist violence and terror in the South. And we're going to begin to disinvest from the Freedmen's Bureau and other Reconstruction programs. And then, this was in 1877, and soon after, you get, through the Supreme Court decision, Plessy versus Ferguson, Jim Crow. And so, this also reflects the kind of tenuous role of the federal government with respect to racial justice and equal rights. And that is that, the federal government has been instrumental in expanding rights for people, but it's also been instrumental in repression. And so I think this is something really important, that as we think about a society without prisons, as we, imagine what abolition might look like, that we remember we've been here before, but the key is not to make the same mistakes again, and to actually realize that abolition democracy, that was the spirit of much of the movement behind the dismantling of slavery.
Thank you for that long history. I guess I'm gonna throw like individual questions so we can kind of move through. So Victoria, can you like briefly like explain to us kind of this long-term vision of abolition and like the practical policy programs like right now? Like what's the long and the short like vision of prison abolition?
I mean, the long-term goal of abolition is just to abolish prisons and the need for them. So not necessarily just open, demolish all the prisons and then everybody lives in chaos world, but, like what we've been talking about throughout this seminar, which is you take that money and you put it where people need it. What is needed? What was needed, in 1990s Queens for Black, brown, and immigrant kids whose parents didn't have resources? What was needed for their family members, so that maybe like, their moms weren't working 2 or 3 jobs and they saw their parents struggling and said, I don't want to follow in their footsteps. That's ridiculous. I don't want to be like, working my butt off to like, for $7 an hour. So what kinds of resources are needed? Looking at some of the people arrested for anti-Asian attacks, we see that some of them have cycled through jail. One guy had 33 arrests. His 34th was when he was harassing an older Asian couple. Another man tried to intervene. He spit on him. He punched him in the face. The police arrested him. It was his 34th arrest. Several of them his previous arrests had happened during mental health crises. What kind of mental health resources need to be in the communities where people are? Mental health resources that are accessible, that you can build a rapport with, not just an impersonal hospital where you go once a month and you see a different clinician every time and you don't know who they are, they don't know who you are, you answer the same questions, they give you a pill, you're done. But what needs to happen? What happens, like what kind of supportive housing might need to be in place? Supportive housing costs money. I mean, housing costs money to begin with. What you know, what else needs to happen so that there can be safety? Because right now what we're doing is saying, you know, with police, you come after the fact and you arrest the guy, and then maybe you hold him, maybe you don't. Eventually he gets out, and nothing has changed. So the long-term goal of abolition is get rid of prisons, have all of those resources in the communities where they are needed. Shorter-term goal is defund, take away, decriminalize things that don't need to be criminalized in the first place: drugs, sex work, you know, doing random things that are criminalized now, like jumping the turnstile. Who cares? It's $2.75. Why are we paying NYPD however much money to stand there at the turnstile to make sure this kid, me, and that person all, you know, get arrested for jumping the turnstile or get policed? How many $2.75 fares could you pay with one of those NYPD salaries? So I think it is like a radical reprioritizing of resources. So looking at what Dr. Hinton was saying about the war on poverty versus the war on crime, and saying, like, let's eradicate not only poverty, but, like, you know, mental health issues. You know, what does that look like? And that looks like a lot more resources where we don't have them now.
Yeah, I think what we keep coming back to is something that Miriam Kaba and Ruth Wilson Gilmore point to, is about like abolition being less about like a destroying and tearing down, but a reimagining of a restructured society. And so I guess real quick, before I hop over to Dwayne, Victoria, can't we just like reform what we have already?
Real quick, no. We've tried it, and it has not worked. And we keep putting our efforts into the same not working solutions.
Yeah, I think Rebecca McClendon, I think, historian, writes the book Crisis of Imprisonment, and I guess what she points to is that like our prison system in the United States was the reform from a method that was used in Western Europe. And so, Dwayne, I want to come to you. So in November, you wrote this article called Kamala Harris, Mass Incarceration in Me. And it puts victims of crime, victims of the criminal legal system, and those responsible for meting out justice in conversation. So as you point out in your article, at the end of a prison sentence is someone weeping. So I'm hoping that you can like help us think about like what abolition might mean for both victims of crime and victims of the criminal legal system.
Yeah, it's above my pay grade. I mean, you know, honestly, I mean, all of it's utopia, though. You talk about a world without crime. I mean, I just steal cars. I'm gonna keep stealing cars. I do my 2 years cost benefit analysis. I stole 5 cars last year, made 150 grand. I got probation. I'm gonna get probation 3 more times. You're not gonna convince me to stop stealing cars. I sell dope. That's what I do. I'm a hustler. That's what I do. You know, like I just personally want an account. Um, I want to develop an account for what we want a system to look like that acknowledges that you're not going to convince everybody to just resources and all. People in Wall Street. Yeah, I mean, look, insider trader. That's just the shit that I do. I'm gonna collect $100 million before you catch me. So for me, you know, we talking about victims. I think Ruthie does this a lot. It's like, what about the victims that we don't think about? The ways in which the oil spill. What happens to the corporations that are always able to evade accountability? What happens to the federal agencies that evade accountability for the decisions that they make? What happens to the property owners who, you know, who waiting for the opportunity right now to evict people who have lost their jobs because of the pandemic? Um, I mean, I personally think all we got in this world is reform, unless we got a nuclear bomb. You know, I mean, I don't know what it looks like to tear something from the ground up, and not. I don't know what the project that's not a reform project looks like, unless you're talking about something that we're doing, you know, in Loudoun County in Virginia, like some small jurisdiction. But on any scalable level, I don't even understand the language of this is not a reform project. I don't understand what the other thing looks like. Do you abandon all of the history of failures and missteps and things we learned and just say let's start from scratch? Like I fully don't understand that. And when I wrote that piece, it was crazy. I mean, I wrote that piece, and during the time I wrote that piece, at least two friends hit me up saying, "Look, prosecutors calling me. They want to release this dude early, but he killed my folks. What should I do? What should I say?" And it's not that these folks believe that prison made it okay. It's that these folks were saying, "My people dead, and they're gonna be dead forever." And what does accountability look like in that world? And I don't think we answer those questions. And I'm not even gonna sit here and pretend like I think it's okay that a black man raped my mom after raping two other women, and that like, yeah, I'm not fucking playing that game. I don't know.
But I think thank you for that. I think you asked the important question is like that gets us thinking like what does accountability look like? Um, and I don't know if we don't have the answer today, but I don't know if we have the answer. But
Because any answer we say, people are afraid to say.
Mhm.
I know what it says in Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Cage Birds Sing, and I ain't never heard nobody criticize that passage. And I know exactly what accountability looked like, then I know why the cage birds sing. And I know how offended I was to read Eldridge Cleaver's Soul on Ice. What? This is what revolution is to you? I mean, like we have narratives of accountability in our community that we don't sanction, and we have narratives of accountability by the state that we don't sanction. I just don't know if I have a narrative of accountability that I could live with when it comes to the most violent things, and I fundamentally believe our system is always defined by the most violent crimes, even if it's just my carjacking. And I don't know. I know it's abolitionists. I know Ruthie Gilmore has done a lot of work. I know Miriam Corbett has done a lot of work. I know there are a lot of public defenders who have done a lot of work trying to answer these questions in very individual cases, talking with victims, trying to build a better sense of what's happening. I know Sujatha Paliga has done a lot of work. What I'm telling you is that I don't have any answers, and ain't nobody gonna make me agree with none of the answers anybody else is giving, because yeah, I just, it is much harder for me having found ways to love people who have done horrible things and been with them as I found ways to love myself for doing something horrible, to imagine a conversation about all of this stuff that doesn't make room for, for like that space. And I'm just saying, I don't know, man. And you live in a fucking world where you're supposed to know everything. I'm just gonna admit I ain't got an answer for that one.
Yeah. Um, Thank you for that, because I think like what it points to is that um, it's complicated, and we got work to do. So I'm gonna throw this question out, and then we're gonna go to the audience.
Makeup is saying we gonna go to the audience for 40 minutes.
Uh, uh, so we got all of us that are talking right now got kids. So and Victoria kind of mentioned this at the beginning about these cartoons, and so I have a 3-year-old, and so I'm often like monitoring what she watches, and like so much like jail, 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 and like she told me she wanted to put me in jail, and I was like, no, like come on now, I didn't do nothing just because I didn't like let you do something, and so I'm wondering uh, one person can answer that, like what do we want like this world when we think about public safety to look like for like the folk that we're raising, or like other folk that are going to inherit this world? What do we want that to look like?
When I think about public safety, and I think when we ask ourselves about safety, the first thing that comes to mind is not a police officer in a uniform with a gun. For me, public safety is a world where every child has a decent meal to eat every day and lives in a home that doesn't have vermin in it and has access to a robust education and can fulfill their dreams, whatever those dreams look like. And I want that for my children. I want that for everybody's children. And I don't want them to live in a world where I have to be worried about, where I guess I want to live in a world where I no longer have to be worried about how people are going to respond to them, or the potential violence that they could face as Black people in this country. I want that to end.
Anybody else? So I'll take these two questions from Q&A. So thank y'all. So one of the questions, and I apologize to the folks that asked questions. We're not going to be able to get to all of them. One of them says that what are the ways that education may like disrupt like the carceral state or like reduce confinement?
You said the ways education?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's cool. I mean, I know me and Elizabeth have been talking about the Million Book Project for a while, and foundationally, it's about what does it mean for you to be an agent in your own freedom? And I think education allows you to be an agent in your own freedom, and to think really about some of these complicated issues so that you could arrive at, I mean, somebody said it's another cat I know who, he got put on the, I hate talking about people's story when they ain't around, but he got put on this commission, this Reform the Police Commission somewhere, right? And he had killed a cop when he was like 16, did a bunch of time. Brilliant dude, like fucking genius, right? And I don't even mean genius as in like Cornel West, but I mean like soulful, and just knows things, right? And he had anyway, there was all of this outcry around it, and he about him being on this commission when they found out what he was locked up for. And he was like, they have never said anything to me that I haven't said about myself and to myself for the last 40 years. He was like, you cannot make me feel more guilty than I do for the life that I took in this world. And he talks about how education got him to a point where, I mean, like stunningly capable of having all of the complicated conversations and arrive at the place where we want folks to arrive at. And he went into prison illiterate. He went into prison completely uneducated, and now it's just impressive. I argued with this dude for 30 minutes about Frankel's man's search for meaning. Like, who does that? You know what I mean? Like this is the nerdiest shit in the world. But I think education is critical in giving people agency. I also think I'm biased because I like books and I like education, and it's a way in which we privilege people who have one kind of education over people who have another kind of education, and we do that both when people go in front of the parole board, and we do that when people go up for clemency, and we have to take that into account as well. But we live in a world where the griots have always had word, and education is the pathway to being a griot.
Thank you. The last question that from the Q&A that I'll bring up is someone asked, what do y'all think about like this mainstream attention that these like three movements or these simultaneous movements have gotten? Do you like think that they have like diluted the struggle for some like radical change since now like media is aware of them, and politicians are using them for their own purposes? Do we think that it's diluted like some radical change, the possibility for radical change?
Well, I think that it's good that people are talking about these things. I mean, what Dwayne was saying earlier was that, he came out of prison and all these progressive nonprofits were like, no, we can't give you a job, sorry. And now they're like, oh, come here. I mean, we don't want people to be opportunistic, but, like there's now space for those kinds of dialogues, whereas 10, 15, 20 years ago, there was no space for a dialogue. My daughter is now 20. When she was 6, 7, 8, I would go to these you go to these birthday parties for other kids in the class and you don't really know anybody and you're standing there and some other parent would be like, oh, you're Suling's mom, what do you do? And I'd be like, oh, I write about prisons, women in prison. And they would take a step back. And I'd be like, oh yeah, you know, I'm working on this story about this. And they would take another step back. And, you know, like it was just like, and then, you know, I would say something else and they would be out the door, or they would be like on the other side of the room. And I think that having defund, decriminalize, abolish being talked about opens that door, at least a little sliver, so people will at least stay there long enough for you to get more than 3 sentences out of your mouth. So I think it is a door opener, because it's not suddenly like you're talking about something I've never heard of before. I was just saying I write about prisons. I wasn't talking about abolition. I wasn't like, hey, I'm a prison abolitionist. What do you do? And the mom is like, I'm gonna take my kid and leave now. Like she, you know, it was just really like, I talk about prisons. And the minute Orange is the New Black hit Netflix, I would say I write about prisons, and people would be like, oh, like Orange is the New Black. And I was like, yes, let me tell you now all the issues that they've kind of like gotten wrong, you know, but it created that space where suddenly people who had not been touched by incarceration, or thought they had not been touched by incarceration, were willing to at least listen, you know? And so I think that having, you know, more media attention, more dialogue about this means that there's more space to talk to people who might otherwise have just clutched their pearls and run away.
Thank you. So I want to thank y'all for, you know, joining this conversation and helping us think about this and this dialogue, and you know, informing folks epistemology about these subjects. Marie, can you go ahead and share the screen? So before y'all leave, like 2 things. One, I'm gonna do like the pastor does at the end. Like, we are a nonprofit organization. The money that we get goes to support our programs that support incarcerated and formerly incarcerated learners. These type of events are, we do these for volunteers. So we appreciate your donations. You can go to the Petey Greene, peteygreen.org to donate, or you can donate by Venmo. We take small or large donations. And then lastly, at the close of the Zoom, there's going to be a survey that pops up. We appreciate your feedback, and, you know, to give us ideas about what we should do going forward. This is our last one for the semester. Yeah, so thank y'all for the panelists, and thank y'all for hanging out with us today. And I hope this has like helped like shift some thinking, or to get you thinking more. And so there's going to be a survey that comes up, and we'll stay on for a little bit. But like, really thank y'all. And there's a song that's coming up too. Marie.